the radical, fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
All right, welcome everybody. I hope you had a great weekend. I see Facebook is working again. That's always good. So we're broadcasting both on Facebook and on YouTube, and I think on Periscope as well. So good to see everybody here. I hope you had a good weekend. As I said, I spent 3 hours on the beach today. It was amazing. It was fantastic. I'm a little tired, I have to say. My wife, before the show began, said, maybe the lesson learned is show, beach, same day, not a good idea. So I hope you guys aren't freezing too badly in wherever you might be, but the beach was amazing. Sun was shining. The weather was perfect, mid-80s, just gorgeous. Just gorgeous. All right. Yeah, you should be jealous. You should all be jealous. But you can always move to Puerto Rico and join me here. So you can do something about your jealousy. All right, we're talking about China today, and we're talking about America today, and we're going to talk specifically about Marco Rubio, but really what Marco Rubio represents more than anything else, not him specifically. But I will be showing you a speech of his and commenting on his speech as we go along. So obviously there's been a lot of talk about China since Trump was elected, or even before that, during the campaign. And China has been positioned as this enemy, is maybe strong, but rival of the United States. And there's a rivalry out there in the world between the United States and China. And, and China cheats, and China subsidizes its industries, and China does all these things. It steals intellectual property, and of course we know all the individual rights violations. They intern the Muslim population in what look like camps. They are clearly trying to violate the rights of Hong Kong and trying to crush freedom in Hong Kong. And they'd be building artificial islands in the South China Sea. On and on and on we can go with examples of China asserting itself, and with the perception in the United States of China as a rival. And of course Donald Trump has chosen to deal with this with tariffs, with taxing Americans in order to reduce importation of Chinese goods, in an attempt to reduce the trade deficit, and also in an attempt to kind of twist China's arm into buying more American stuff. I don't think that the purpose of the tariffs, as I've said many, many times, is to reduce China's IP theft or any of those things. I think the primary purpose from Trump's mind is to get them to buy more American stuff, because he views trade deficits as somehow negative, and he wants to reduce the trade deficit. So there is this, it's now everybody's talking about it. So if 3-4 years ago nobody was talking about China, now everybody is talking about China, and China is, the perception is China is the primary rival of the United States, and something must be done. Something must be done. And Marco Rubio gave a speech recently at the National Defense University articulating what he thinks needs to be done. So I want to talk today about this rivalry. What is the essential characteristic? What is the fundamental? What is the rivalry about? In what sense? Is China a rival to the United States? And I think there is a sense in which it is. We basically have two models of governance: a Chinese model and an American model. If you will, two approaches to the philosophy of government, the philosophy of politics, of what the role of government should be, the place of government in society, and the role of the individual. We've got two very, very different views, a Chinese view and an American view. And historically, we all know what America stood for. America stood for the individual. America stood for limited government. America stood for a government whose primary role, really its only role, is the protection of the individual. It's to make possible the individual's pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness by eliminating coercion, force, authority from his life. And the original vision of America was that vision of individualism, of the primacy of the individual, the primacy of the right of the individuals to live his life as he sees fit. And the role of the government is there, again, to protect our rights, our individual rights. And other than that, leave us alone. Now, it's true that our government has violated that principle almost from day one, maybe from day one. It is regulated, it is controlled, it is taxed, it has inserted itself into our lives over and over and over again over the last 240 years. But it's still true, at least it was true, that America was perceived as the land of capitalism. America was perceived as the land of individualism. America was perceived as the land of freedom. Freedom meaning individual freedom. Freedom meaning freedom of the individual from coercion, from force, from authority. And while America has always, again from day one, violated this principle has guided it. It's made it unique. It's really framed what you could call an American character of individualism, of self-reliance, of standing for oneself, living for oneself, a spirit that is an American spirit, that is uniquely American, can-do, optimism. Just leave me alone and watch what I can do. That is America at its best. It's a country of pioneers, of entrepreneurs, of business leaders, of thinkers, of original thinkers, of self-made men and women going out there and doing their thing. Of building, creating, producing. That has been America. And that has been its focus. It is a land that has always elevated the individual and his rights above all else. Again, massively imperfectly, with massive compromises from day one, slavery, for example, all the way till today, where the compromises have changed, and over the last 100 years have gotten worse and worse and worse. But overall, at the end of the day, the American spirit seems to shrug all that off and reestablish itself. The American spirit seems to always come back and assert itself. We are the land of individuals. We are the land of self-reliance. We are the land of freedom. That is the America I love, and I think that is the America most of you love. Now, what has China represented? Well, certainly in its history, and I'm not going to go back into ancient history, but certainly in its 20th century, China has represented kind of the absolute opposite of this. China has represented collectivism. It has represented the elevation of the tribe, of the group, of the collective, of the proletarian for a long time, above all else. China has been was ruled from 1945, 6, 7, late 40s, until certainly 1978, by a brutal dictator who was willing to sacrifice tens of millions of people for the common good, for a dream of collectivistic utopia. In China, in communist China of Mao Zedong, the individual was nothing. There was no individual. The group is all that mattered. And the group was represented by the party, by the Communist Party, represented by Mao Zedong, represented by the Philosopher King, who could commune with the spirit of the group and tell us what we could and couldn't do, what we should and shouldn't do. The exact opposite of the American vision. There was an authority, there was force, there was coercion in every single aspect of their lives. China was turned into the ultimate in collectivism. And the consequences are obvious: death, destruction, starvation, re-education, starvation, death, destruction, just on and on and on. Now, luckily for the Chinese, and I think luckily for anybody who values human life, that particular form of collectivism ended in 1978. And since then, a different China has arose. Now, still with the same ideology. We do what's good for, take this off for a while. We do what's good for China. We do what's good for the common good. We do what's good for the collective. And in, Deng Xiaoping's view, and in the view of the leadership of China's view, what was good for China was, in some areas, in some places, to liberate their economy. Because they traveled the world and they saw that economic freedom actually leads to prosperity. And the leaders of China, pragmatists, collectivist pragmatists, rather than ideologically communist dictators, China turned to pragmatism under Deng Xiaoping and really stayed that way, and I think to some extent still is that way. It's a pragmatist nation. But in the name of the collective, still believes that you need an authority. You need somebody to challenge the will of the people. You need somebody to decide the common good. You need somebody to decide what is good for China and what is not. What is right and what is wrong. Who should prosper and who should not. Who should succeed and who should fail. China has held on to the belief that you need an authority to be able to do that. You need an authority to guide the country, to determine its economy. Now, at the same time, they recognize that they also need freedom in order to get rich. So they left certain part of China, certainly the south near Hong Kong, Shanghai, and other districts around China. They left them mostly free in the economic realm. They mostly left people alone. Not out of respect, a deep respect for individualism, but out of a pragmatic understanding that the way to create wealth was to leave people alone, to let them do their thing, like America had done and like most of the West had done. And indeed, it worked. It worked so well in the area close to Hong Kong that they expanded it to Shanghai and they expanded elsewhere. And in all those places have boomed. Those places have thrived. Those places have had economic freedom on the par with the West, often exceeding the economic freedom we have in the West. And the results have been massive wealth creation. And with a population of 1.4 billion people, China needs massive wealth creation, because even today, as rich as people claim China is, per capita GDP, the wealth of individual Chinese and individual income is very, very low. China, on the individual basis, is still unbelievably poor. So China pragmatically freed up a big section of its economy, a big section of its landmass. And you got a huge disparity between parts of China that were left authoritarian state-run enterprises where the government dictate everything and all, and those places that were basically left alone. You got a huge wealth disparity, and you saw massive migration from the poor, regulated, controlled areas into the areas in which there was relative freedom. And that explains the growth of these massive cities and the growth of wealth and growth of the success of China is all a consequence of those areas that were left free. But the Chinese authorities are not willing to learn the lesson from that. They stick to the idea that the common good must be pursued. and that the common good cannot be pursued with political freedom. Majorities do not know what's good. You need an authority. You need experts. You need experts to guide the economy, to decide when it's okay to be free, when it's not okay to be free, where it's okay to be free, where it's not okay to be free. So China has had, over the last 40 years, a kind of a managed economy with elements, areas that have been left to be semi-capitalist and others that are being completely controlled. The left has come to call what China has state capitalism, as if that is a possibility. And the left has recognized that there's something amazing about this model. Because the left in America and in the West generally agrees with China. America's too individualistic. There's too much emphasis on the individual. The individual doesn't really matter that much. What matters is the common good. What matters is what's good for the nation, what's good for the country, what's good for the poor, what's good for most people. Now, the Chinese don't care that much about the poor, but they do care about the common good and the nation. And the left has embraced this idea and has criticized capitalism. And you see this from economists and thinkers on the left that say, look, China's going much faster with this state-run capitalism. Maybe we in the West should adopt state-run capitalism. Maybe we in the West should give government more power, more authority, to have industrial policy, to have more say into what is happening. Bernie Sanders maybe doesn't go all the way, but Jeremy Corbyn certainly did. Let's maybe nationalize some of the industries and have our own state-run industries. And the left has been saying this the last 10, 15 years as they've seen China's success. And these are now two models that the world looks at. They still have the delusion, I would say, that America represents capitalism, because it does in its spirit still represent capitalism. And then they look at China and they see China representing this form of collectivism, the common good, China representing this form of so-called state capitalism. And they're saying, okay, which one should we choose? And many have chosen the Chinese model, at their own detriment, because China has been growing much faster. China seems to have the more dynamic economy. China seems to be economically more successful than the United States. So many countries adopting the Chinese model, and I think many people in America are looking at China with jealousy, with envy. So, we have today a competition of visions, a competition about the kind of system we should have. America, which is basically, again, ideologically individualistic, free, limited government, protection of individual rights. And China, which I don't think is communist, I think is more fascist and resembles fascism in its state control of industry with some elements of freedom, kind of a true, kind of really heightened mixed economy, where you can really see it. Some of the economy is owned by the state, run by the state, controlled by the state. Some of the economy is left alone. And you can see that contrast. And those are two visions, but all guided in China by what is good for the state, what is good for the common good, what is good for the people. What the philosopher, and therefore must be guided by philosopher kings, because only they can tell, markets can't tell, what is good for the common good. So you've got an economy based on markets, an economy based on authority and central planning. An authority and central planning that once in a while decides that markets are best and therefore leaves the markets alone. And those are two visions. Those are two visions that dominate right now the world. Nobody in the world out there right now, other than a few wacky American academics and maybe some European academics, nobody in the world out there believes in communism. Even Zizek, the communist, doesn't believe in communism if you actually watch his videos. They're no communists. There's nobody out there saying we should nationalize all the means of production. We should have complete government control over everything. No. The real competition is between capitalism as imagined in the U.S. and so-called state capitalism in China. And again, the left in the United States has already sided with China, has already given in, and has already accepted the fact that China has the right model. We want to mix it in with a little democracy, not too much democracy, a little democracy. We would like some democracy with our central planning. We would like some democracy with our industrial policy. We would like some democracy with the common good and everything focused on the common good and to hell with the individual. But basically, we want the Chinese model. And supposedly standing up against them has been the right. The conservatives, the Republicans, however you want to define them, who have argued that no, the American system is the system of individualism. It's a system of individual freedom. It's a system of the Founding Fathers. They hearken to the Founding Fathers nonstop. It's a system of capitalism. We believe in markets, and we think markets are wonderful, and we should stick with markets. And no, the Chinese are wrong. Their system is wrong. It won't work. But those Republicans, conservatives, people on the right, sadly are all gone. And the conclusion I think we have to come to today is that China has won. The Chinese model is the model that everybody today wants to follow. Even in criticizing China, we want to follow the Chinese model. China interferes in the markets, so we should interfere in the markets. China uses tariffs, so we should use tariffs. China uses industrial policy, so we should have industrial policy. Oh, we'll leave some of the market free, but the government will intervene in other parts where it knows that it's in the common good. Now, this has always been, and I've talked about this, part of what's called nationalist conservatives, or conservative nationalists, or whatever, the nationalist wing that have talked about industrial policy. But there have been voices on the right that you always think are a little bit more sensible. Never super sensible. If they were super sensible, I don't know any Republicans super sensible about these issues. But I want to now show you some of a speech by Marco Rubio. Somebody who stood up against Trump, supposedly, against nationalism, supposedly. But is also representative, I think, of the mainstream Republican Party, not the radical right, not the radical nationalists, not the complete leftists, somewhere in between. He was a Tea Party candidate, after all. A believer, supposedly, in American individualism, a believer, supposedly, in American capitalism, a believer, supposedly, in American founding and what America represents. Now, I believe that this speech by Marco Rubio basically announces the death of anybody on the right. Now, maybe there are a few voices here and there who represents America. I think China has won. I texted a friend of mine today. I said, we are all Chinese now. All right, now, maybe you don't believe me. Let's listen and see how Marco Rubio thinks we should stand up to China. What is his recipe for the United States in this big struggle, in this ideological struggle, in the struggle for vision for the future, for us and for the rest of mankind? How does he think America should position itself? What should America do facing the challenge? In my view, the ideological challenge. Facing the challenge, in my view, a challenge of the philosophy of governance that China represents. Remember, China is collectivism, the common good, state control of industry, where it wants to, but leaving some parts free. What is Rubio's view of this? All right, now, let's see. I've got a transcript of it as well. So I'm starting in the middle, the first 10 minutes, 35 seconds. And I'm not going to go through the whole thing, although we'll hopefully hear a chunk of this. We'll see. We'll see how far it goes. So here we start where, this is where I think Rubio really sets out the fundamental challenge, right? The fundamental challenge. And this is his words here. I'm just going to read it to you and then I'll have him speak it. He says, the fundamental challenge is that China seeks to prove that you can have a prosperous society, a content citizenry, and be the world's major power without respect for human dignity, freedom, or God. Well, put aside God a second. Without respect for human dignity, freedom. Now, he doesn't say individualism, of course, because he can't, because he's not. But China wants to show that it can do all these things. It can be prosperous and all this other stuff by being collectivist, by being centrally planned. And he understands that that is the real fundamental challenge. What's our solution to that?
So while it may be true that China is, quote, breaking the rules, or that Chinese companies are engaging in unfair competition against the American order, the fundamental challenge will not be simply solved by some future trade agreement.
He's right.
The fundamental challenge is that China seeks to prove that you can have a prosperous society, a contented citizenry, and be the world's major power. And you can have all these things without respecting human dignity and freedom or even a belief in God.
Now, here in a sense, I agree with Rubio. The issue is not this or that trade practice. The issue is not this or that subsidy or this or that tariff. The issue is fundamental. Is the Chinese model the right model, or is the American model the right model? That is the fundamental conflict right now that we face. Which one is the right model? And he says they want to show that you can be successful. Now, if he had a proper understanding of history, of the mind, of human beings, he'd know that China's model has to fail, and will fail. But he doesn't have that understanding, so this is the challenge. And he's right about the challenge. How do we solve it, though?
The second reason we have to respond to the challenges before us is because the industries that China intends to dominate are the very ones that will create the dignified and productive work. The kind of dignified and productive work that Americans need for us to remain a strong nation.
So this is really big, right? So the other threat is a pragmatic threat. China wants to dominate industries that and by doing so, it's going to take jobs away from Americans. Dignified and productive work, and that work is essential for the American character, and we can't let that happen. In the name of what? American individualism?
Now, responding to the challenge will require us to reject the fundamentalism that argues that the greatest virtue in American policy is to maximize economic efficiency.
Now, notice what he's saying here. Responding to this challenge will require us to reject the fundamentalism that argues that the greatest virtue in American policy, I assume economic policy is meant here, is to maximize efficiency. Now, that's code word for what we need to reject is the fundamental idea that capitalism. That's what efficiency stands in for. It stands for markets. It stands for capitalism. It stands for freedom. In other words, Rubio says that if we're going to combat China, the one thing we have to give up is capitalism. The one thing we have to give up is economic efficiency. The one thing we have to give up is free markets. That, he says, is unacceptable. In other words, in order to defeat the Chinese, as we'll see, we must become like them. There it is.
The market will always reach the most efficient economic outcome. The problem is that sometimes the most efficient economic outcome is at odds with the common good and the national interest.
So we're adopting the Chinese view that the role of the government is not to protect individual rights. The role of the government is not to protect our individual freedoms. The role of the government is not to protect our property rights and to leave us alone. The goal of the government is to seek out the common good and the national interest. The common good and the national interest. That sounds like China to me.
Outsourcing jobs to China might be more efficient. It lowers the labor costs and increases the profits. But the good jobs we lose end up destroying families and communities.
Do we lose jobs? I've said this over and over and over and over again. Unemployment today in the United States is lower than it's ever been. Supposedly, right? That's what Trump constantly tells us. And it's low. And Americans are at work. Wages are actually rising. We've got amazing jobs in the United States because we've restructured our economy to get rid of low productivity jobs. Jobs in the Midwest, jobs in manufacturing, jobs, all kinds of jobs. And invested in high productivity jobs. Silicon Valley, technology around Austin, biotech in Boston and San Diego. Really? Good jobs we are losing because of outsourcing? I'd say the opposite. We're gaining fantastic jobs because of outsourcing. Because what the outsourcing does is it frees up capital in the United States to invest in things that are much more value increasing. So let's adopt the left's ideology. Let's adopt the ideology that says that outsourcing and capitalism actually hurt jobs. That outsourcing, capitalism actually hurts wealth. That wealth creation is not a consequence of capitalism. No. Because capitalism is about self-interest. Capitalism is about the individual. Capitalism is what America was about. But we're not about America. We're going to fight China not by being America.
Just last year, a study found that areas of the United States that faced Chinese import saturation from 1990 through the year 2014 experienced drops in male employment, as well as declining marriage and fertility rates.
Now, I want to know again, if all these men are losing their jobs, how come unemployment is so low? And this is the same as what the left does. I've critiqued a number of leftist videos recently by different leftist commentators on YouTube, and they all use the same thing. They use one study, one bogus statistic that they pull out from nowhere, and they cite it over and over and over again, and they generalize from it. Statistics are dangerous. Studies are dangerous, unless you understand how they're done and what's really going on. You can find any result you want. And yes, it's quite possible that jobs are gone, but does he know that those jobs are gone because of China? This is areas that faced Chinese import saturation. What does Chinese import saturation mean? Aren't we all facing Chinese import saturation? Isn't the whole of America facing Chinese import saturation? Then shouldn't there be massive amounts of job losses in America? Why is unemployment so low? Why is the economy growing? Why are the most innovative, productive, creative companies in the world in the United States of America still? I can't believe I'm the optimist here. Why the doom and gloom? Well, as I've said many times, you have to convince people that everything is horrible and falling apart, that the world is in terrible shape, so that you can inflict something radical on them, so that they will accept things that they wouldn't otherwise accept. Oh, there we go.
In communities that bore the brunt of what some call normalizing trade relations with China, we even see jumps in suicide rates.
This is the same guy who used to be pro-free trade.
From substance abuse.
Now, it's interesting. Today's not the show where I'm going to talk about suicide and substance abuse. I will talk about that later. I think it's Rubio's fault. I think it's Trump's fault. I think it's Obama's fault. I think it's the political class and the elites in this country's fault that we have so many suicides and we have so much drug abuse. And it has to do with the false promises they made. It has to do with their collectivism and their nationalism and the common good. It has to do with the betrayal of the American dream that they have engaged in. It has to do with the lack of demand of people to take responsibility for their own life. It has to do with the lack of moral leadership in this country. That's the reason we have suicides and a drug problem. Not because of China. Not because of China. How weak would we be? How weak would you say the American character is? How weak would you say our country is if China could cause people to commit suicide in mass and go on drugs in the United States? It's just not true. Something profound has changed in this country. And what's changed in this country is a lack of individual responsibility, a lack of belief in the American dream, a lack of insistence on individualism, on the sanctity of individual life, and a coddling of people. A whole generation that expects to have a job, that expects to have health care, that expects to be taken care of by government. And then when it doesn't turn out to be rosy when that happens, it doesn't turn out to be really, really good when that happens, then yeah, it's depressing. But we were promised. And as I say, and I continue to say, get in the frigging car and drive to where the jobs are. Because there are plenty of jobs in this country. Even today, there are plenty of jobs in this country. Get in your car, drive there. You don't have a car, get a bus ticket. Your ancestors got on boats, traveled 3 months in stormy weather to reach a shore where nothing was promised to them. But today, we have promised so much in this country that people are depressed. That people are depressed because our politicians and our intellectuals cannot live up to those promises. They should have never promised them to begin with.
So for policymakers, the common good can't just be about corporate profits. It can't
The common good just can't be about corporate profits, right? It's not about corporate
be
profits.
about finding economic efficiency. When dignified
In other words, it can't be about capitalism. The common good cannot be about capitalism. Now, I mean, this is great, because let's lay it out exactly the way it is.
particularly for men, goes away, so too goes away the backbone of our culture. The evidence shows our communities become blighted and wither away, families collapse, and fewer people get married. And ultimately, it ruptures the soul of our nation.
Now, let's say it was true that we've got a job shortage in this country. That's what's really killing Americans in this country, is the fact that we don't have enough jobs. What would a pro-capitalist president propose as a solution for this? How about dramatic rolling back regulations, not the trickle Bailey deregulation of the Trump administration, but radical deregulation, doing away with a big regulatory bill that Congress passed, one every month. Big deregulation. How about big getting government out of our lives? How about a rollback in entitlements? How about rollbacks? How about, this is the principle. If we want more jobs in America, if we want better jobs in America, if we want more productive jobs in America, if we want more high-paying jobs in America, how about we make America more capitalist? Even the Chinese know that. You give people freedom and poof, wealth is created. Productive jobs are created. Why don't we do that? Why don't we do that? How about some economic free zones in America? But no. No, the solution of Marco Rubio, the solution of the Republican Party, the solution is to cave to the left and to cave to China. The solution is, in the name of the common good, give up on capitalism. In the name of the common good, give up on efficiency. In the name of the common good, give up on America. Give up on what made America, still makes America great.
This experience has become essentialized today in images of decaying Rust Belt towns and the epidemic of working class deaths of despair. But this story is playing out just as destructively in our nation's inner cities. From Flint to Phoenix, from Baltimore to Birmingham, the erosion of dignified work is colorblind and is geographically limitless.
I agree with that. Let's eliminate minimum wages. Let's make it a federal law that you cannot raise at the local level minimum wages. The localities cannot. Let's establish economic freedom in this country. And then you will get wages going up, jobs being created, high productivity, wealth creation. But God forbid that anybody should advocate for freedom. God forbid that we should actually advocate for an American solution. No, the solution must be a Chinese solution. Now, you'll see, he gives lip service to free enterprise and capitalism.
Now, to be clear, free enterprise is the greatest mechanism man has ever employed for achieving prosperity.
But he doesn't believe that. He doesn't believe that. Or if he does, he doesn't care. Prosperity is not his goal. You'd think it was, because jobs, prosperity seem to go together. Maybe we don't have free markets today. Maybe all our problems are not China. Maybe all our problems are not the Chinese taking our jobs. Maybe our problems today is regulation, taxes, welfare state, entitlements, and an American modern mentality of entitlement, sitting on your hands and waiting, of a welfare mentality. Maybe that's the problem, Senator Rubio. The solution should be capitalism. But no.
At the same time, we must always remember that the market is agnostic as to whether America is a high or a low wage economy. The market
Really? I mean, all evidence suggests, is market really agnostic? A market, is capitalism a place? Places that implement capitalism, do they tend to be low-wage economies? No. When capitalism is implemented, wages are rising, and it tend to be high-wage economies. America is a high-wage economy because of capitalism. If it isn't today, it's because it has moved away from capitalism. China became relatively high wage only when it adopted capitalism, and even then the wages are low until it fully embraces capitalism. Hong Kong has become a high wage place, the financial center of Asia, because it adopted capitalism. I mean, come on, Rubio. You know better than this. Or you used to, or you pretended to know once.
agnostic on whether a certain outcome is in our national interest or the common good.
Now that is true. Markets cannot tell what the common good is. Markets cannot tell what the common good is, because there is no such thing as the common good, the public interest. What is the common good? What is the public interest? It's whose interest? Who is the common? Who is the public? And by the way, who gets to decide? It cannot be markets. Markets don't know what's in the common good or the public interest. So who does decide? Who is Marco Rubio going to give the power to make the decisions about what is in the public good and the common interest, or the other way around, whatever? Well, of course, the only people who can make that decision are the philosopher kings, the rulers, the politicians, the government, the state. Now place them above us as individuals. Place them above the market. And then let them make decisions about what is in our common good and what is in the public interest.
Might be agnostic, but policymakers like me cannot be.
He's a policymaker, he's a politician, he is a ruler, he is a philosopher king. He knows what's in the common good. He has that power. I don't have that power. But he has the power. The power to see into the minds of men. The power to aggregate all this information. The power to know what is good for me and what is good for you and what is good for all of us. And you know what? If we have to sacrifice a few individuals here and there, if we have to sacrifice some businessmen, if we have to sacrifice some billionaires, if we have to sacrifice these employees for those employees, if we have to sacrifice, auto workers for steel workers and steel workers for farm workers and farm workers for somebody else, only, big brother, only policymakers like Marco Rubio can do that. He's got a big brain. He knows what's in the common interest. He is a philosopher king.
I suspect that many, if not all of you, men and women who are here because you are committed to our national security, are not agnostic either. For example, the market may say short-term profits justify adhering to the requirements that China places on our companies. But policymakers must take into account that long-term surrendering of our productive capacity to China is reckless.
Really? We're surrendering our productive capacity to China by outsourcing? It doesn't work that way. Economics, business, take a business course.
The market may say that Americans, often unwittingly, should invest in Chinese firms. But policymakers must take into account whether American investors should be capitalizing the very firms that steal from our companies, that commit human rights abuses, and develop the weapons that could one day kill the men and women.
Now, imagine a speech that actually focused on China's committing human rights violations. That would be interesting, but nobody does that. Nobody focuses on that. Trade deficits, they focus on lots of other things. And yeah, I've already proposed how to deal with them stealing from our companies. What do we do with thieves? Well, we outlaw them. We ban them. If Chinese companies steal IP from American companies, don't let their products enter the United States. Put pressure on all governments around the world to stop trade in stolen goods. We can do it with Gucci bags, Louis Vuitton products. Why can't we do it with high-tech software? Because that's not really the issue. It's not really what we care about. The issue is power. Really, the issue is people like Marco Rubio, people like Donald Trump, people like Bernie Sanders and Biden and all the politicians out there. What they really, really are jealous of is the power that the Chinese government has. They're not concerned about IP. They're not if they would, there are things they could do about it. They're not concerned about human rights violations. If there was things they could do about it. They're not concerned about any of this.
This is not a call to socialism or a rejection of capitalism.
Yes, it is. It actually is a call for socialism and a rejection of capitalism, and indeed it's a call for fascism, which is a form of socialism, one could argue.
A call to policymakers to remember that the national interest, not economic growth alone, is our central obligation.
So the national interest, what is that? Who decides that? How is it defined? Give us a principle. Marco, tell us what national interest means. I mean, should have a definition. It should have a way you should be able to represent it. What does it mean? You want to change the way America is in the name of the national interest, but you never define what it is because it's in your mind and in most people's minds, it's a collectivistic floating abstraction that means nothing but grants you immense power.
This isn't a call to recreate the economy of America's past.
Yes, it is.
It's a call to invest and compete in the emerging industries of the future instead of forfeiting them to China.
How are we going to compete? Well, you'll see in a minute.
And this isn't a knee-jerk call to protectionism.
Yes, it is.
It's a call to maintain the technological and industrial superiority necessary.
That's called competition.
Defend our interests and ensure that working Americans have access to dignified and productive work.
And the best way to do that is to bring more freedom to the American economy.
Now, the critics of the approach that I've just laid out argue that I'm making us choose industries to favor, that I'm arguing that we need to pick winners and losers.
Yes, that's exactly what you're doing. What you're arguing for is an industrial policy. Indeed, this section in the speech is titled, Revitalizing American Industrial Policy.
But the truth is, we are already doing that.
Yeah, that's true. We already have a mixed economy, and we already got the government involved in much of our economy. And you'd think an American conservative would argue against that, not use that to justify doing even more of it.
The difference is, the path we are on now is allowing Beijing to do the picking and the choosing. How secure or prosperous can America be if it cannot carry out heavy industry or pharmaceutical manufacturing or advanced technology? American policymakers have an obligation to pursue policies that make our economy more productive by identifying the critical value of specific industrial sectors and spurring investment in these sectors.
Did you pay attention to that? This is important. American policymakers must pursue policies that make our economy more productive by identifying the critical value of specific industries industrial sectors, and spurring investment in them. Now, this is industrial policy. This is the state picking winners and losers. This is the state decided which industries win and which industries lose. This is the state centrally planning. This is Japan's model before it completely failed in the late 1980s. This is the Japanese model that Americans envied at the time, and this is the Chinese model of state-run enterprises, a model that even in China is failing because the successful portions of the Chinese economy are those portions of the economy that are left free from such manipulation. But Marco Rubio is calling for identifying government, let's be clear, government, identifying the critical value of specific industrial sectors and spurring investment in them. I call that subsidies. In other words, let's be very, very clear. He's arguing for the Chinese model. He doesn't want to give up on capitalism completely. There'll be certain sectors in the economy that will be left free, just like they are in China. But others, the important ones, the ones that he, the commander-in-chief, the chief regulator, the chief central planner, will identify as crucial to American interest and the common good, there the government will intervene. There we will have state-run enterprises. We won't call them that. We'll pretend they're private. But we'll provide them with capital, we'll spur investment, and we'll make sure they can't outsource their jobs. It's truly unbelievable. It's right in front of us. And is there a single voice out there, a single voice that is talking against this? Is there a single voice calling Marco Rubio on this? Is there a single voice in the intellectual landscape of the right calling them on this? No. No. Well, me.
The depletion of American manufacturing has left us with a tremendous national security vulnerability.
Prove that. Prove that. No evidence to that.
I am not advocating for a government takeover of our means of production.
No, the fascists never say that. The fascists always say, no, I'm not a socialist. I don't want the government to own the means of production. I just want them to control the means of production. All right, a little bit more. Let's go.
What I am calling for is us to remember that from the Second World War to the space race and beyond, a capitalist America has always relied on public-private collaboration to further our national security.
Now, these are the talking points of the left. This is what the left has always said. This is what Obama said. What's the difference? Everybody wants me to always vote Republican, but what's the difference between them? They're all statist central planners. They all long for the days of World War II when the government controlled the economy. Doubtful that was a good thing, even though we did win the war. Listen to the next paragraph. This is a gem.
And from the internet to GPS, many of the innovations that have made America a technological superpower originated from national defense-oriented public-private partnerships.
Again, the left's talking point. Oh no, you can't give capitalism the credit for the iPhone. All that stuff in the iPhone all came from government projects. I mean, I've talked about that a lot, why that is a bogus argument. But again, you're hearing this left and right. There's no difference.
This kind of collaboration is not a rejection of capitalism.
Yes, it is. It's exactly
it is a
rejection
call
of
to
capitalism.
encourage and harness the dynamism of our economy's most productive private industries to further our national security and ultimately to further our national economic development.
And here
Frankly, it is a call for a 21st century pro-American industrial policy.
And why do we need this? Notice this next paragraph.
When it comes to Chinese firms, our companies aren't competing with private enterprises. They're competing with a large and powerful nation state.
So let's copy them. Let's copy them. Because they subsidize the industries, we should subsidize their industries. Because they have controls of trade, we should have controls of trade. Because they have the common good, we should practice the common good. Because they have an authoritarian government, maybe we should, we won't go there because democracy is still God in this country. We won't go quite there. Won't go that far. But everything else, we just copy them. This is why I titled the show, The Chinese Have Won. It's over. And Marco Rubio is right here. He's surrendering. And Marco Rubio, basically representing Trumpist philosophy. Marco Rubio has become a Trumpist since Trump won. And it's just surrendered. The United States to China. It's over, guys. Their model won. Our politicians are convinced of it. And I fear the American people are convinced of it.
And in the long run, it is a competition that market fundamentalists cannot and will not win. Because China has learned how to leverage access to short-term profits as a way to get many American companies to commit long-term corporate suicide.
Yeah, there it is again, another left to think. American companies think short-term. It's all about short-termism. It's the Chinese central planners. Central planners generally, they're the ones who think long-term. They're the ones who have long-term considerations. And you know why the Chinese can think long-term and why American politicians can't? Because they don't have to get elected. I mean, that's the next step. In order to really, really be able to practice the common good, in order to really, really, really know what the national interest is and impose the common good and the national interest on us, we need to get rid of elections because you know what? He's not going to say this, but you know what? Elections cause us to think short term. Senators have to be elected every 6 years. House members every 2 years. But in China, they don't have to be elected, so they can think really, really long term. Whereas capitalism is all about quarterly profits. It's all about short term. That's why America has invented basically the biotech industry, because it's so short term. They make profits instantly. That's why. It's truly amazing. What happened to my picture up here? Whoops, sorry. All right, doesn't matter. He's rejecting everything about capitalism. And he says,
because China provides their domestic companies the ability to make investments that make no market sense in the short term, but are critical to their national and economic security in the long term.
So, short term versus long term. I mean, the same old anti-capitalist arguments. And again, because China does it, we should do it. They have won. All right. All right, I'm going to skip this. You get the point. Basically, what Rubio is arguing for is the adoption in America of Chinese-like industrial policy, of Chinese-like supportive industries, of Chinese-like management of the economy, all in the name of beating China, all because the Chinese model is better, because the Chinese model allows investment in the long run. The Chinese model allows central planning, which we know is better than markets. Markets are too short-term. Markets are too selfish. Markets are too focused on individual good and not focused on the common good, not focused on the national interest. So we must abandon markets in order to beat China at its own game. Now, I don't know about you guys, because I don't know anymore, but that's just horrific. It's the end of America. It's the end of this country. It's the complete surrender of any kind of principle, any kind of idea that comes from the founding of this country. The surrender of freedom and individualism for the sake of what? For the sake of Chinese central planning imposed on Americans, because it's the only way we can beat China. Now, let me give you an alternative vision. An alternative vision is that capitalism works, that freedom works. It works to make individuals better, both in the short run and in the long run. It works to raise wages and raise productivity. It works to innovate, to produce, to create, to build. It allocates resources where they're most needed. For example, away from stupid jobs and to smart jobs. It increases our ability to produce, to create, to build, to make. And indeed, central planning is a failure. Always has been, always will be. And that China, to the extent that it embraces central planning, to the extent that it ignores what has been successful in China, which are the free economic zones, will fail, will become poor. Indeed, the slowdown in the Chinese economy, which started about 2 years ago, 3 years ago, went down from about 12, 15% to around 6%, and now is going below 6%, is not a consequence of Trump. It's not a consequence of tariffs, but it is a consequence, almost entirely a consequence of their economic central planning. The more they do of it, the more they clamp down on private industry, the more they clamp down on individual thought, the more they restrict freedom of speech, political freedoms, freedom of movement, the more they try to manage ideas, manage entrepreneurs, manage industries, the poorer they will get. There is nothing to fear from an authoritarian China. Because authoritarianism leads to poverty and will lead to poverty. The only reason China is relatively rich is because it loosened up its authoritarian reigns, because it allowed for freedom. If it goes back on that, as it seems to be doing, then there's nothing to fear it. We win hands down. We have not lost millions of jobs to the Chinese. We have lost millions of jobs to technology, which has enhanced our productivity, made us richer, created unbelievably good jobs all over America. What is destroying this country, what is causing suicide rates and drug addiction and general depression and the election of Donald Trump, what is destroying this country is that we have abandoned the ideology of individualism. We have abandoned the vision. We have abandoned the confidence. We have abandoned the idea of the individual standing by himself, relying on himself, pursuing his own happiness for a murky vision of the common good, the national interest, and trade as a zero-sum game. The real depressing thing about America is how great we were, how amazing a vision we had, and how we have walked away from that vision, left and right, holding hands and singing Kumbaya. Yay for industrial policy and central planning. Yay for subsidizing businesses and deciding what's long-term good for America versus the short-termism of capitalism. What's destroyed America is exactly what Ayn Rand said. It's an orgy of altruism, manifest politically in collectivism, a complete and utter betrayal, stabbing in the back of the vision of the founders. And I don't know what it's going to take to resurrect this country. I don't know. Tomorrow, on the show tomorrow, I'll be talking about other developments on the right, even scarier than Marco Rubio. And why we need a real revolution, a revolution that gets us away from right and left as it is today. A re-envisioning of what Americanism is. A reimagining of what this country stands for. A reimagining of individual human life and the role of government and society in it. And until we do that, we are doomed because things are getting worse intellectually. And the future of this country and the future of the world with it is becoming dimmer and dimmer. Jennifer asks, I'll take your super chat questions now. Did China ever have any good philosophical thinkers in the past? Not really. The biggest problem that China has had in its past is that it never had an Aristotle. Because if you think about, did the West have good philosophical thinkers? Well, yeah, but the main one is Aristotle, that has set the West on the right course. But the Greeks asked fundamental basic questions in metaphysics and epistemology. And that the Chinese never had. Its philosophers usually dealt with social issues, with human relationships, you could argue ethics. But there was never a discussion of metaphysics and epistemology. Indeed, when it was a metaphysics, a mysticism, an epistemology of authoritarianism, of, in a sense, Philosopher Kings, of communion with the spirits. And as a consequence, China never had the kind of philosophy that would give it a foundation for liberty and freedom and success. The only way, so it was much more technologically advanced than the West during much of its history. Indeed, the West was significantly poorer than China for much of its history. But it could never break through. It could never have an industrial revolution. It could never have an enlightenment because it didn't have those philosophical foundation. It did not have Aristotle. Now, the only reason today that it is prospering is because it has adopted Western values. Because in those areas of relative freedom, what you're seeing is a respect for science, a respect for the individual, a respect for thinking. That's the hope for China. And when I've been there, I've been quite optimistic, false optimism, I guess, because it's turned back towards authoritarianism. But there is an individualistic spirit in the Chinese. And what they need is the right philosophy to guide it. And that could happen if it's allowed to happen. But the powers to be, there and here, it turns out, don't want it to happen. Now, there was a philosopher by the name of Lao Tzu. I don't know too much about Lao Tzu, but libertarians, free market thinkers in China tell me that Lao Tzu was basically the first libertarian thinker, the first free market thinker. I mean, that's a more positive view of libertarianism. A free market thinker, and he laid the foundation for free markets. But again, I doubt that he had a perspective on epistemology and metaphysics. And